Imagine walking down the aisle, smiling at the man you're about to marry, while a secret buried for 8 years is about to explode in front of everyone. What if the wedding wasn't a celebration, but a trap? What if the bride wasn't just getting married, but unknowingly exposing a criminal empire? Tonight's story isn't about love. It's about betrayal, corruption, and a mother who was never supposed to be found alive. Stay till the end, because this wedding changes everything. The wedding of Aliyah Rahman was supposed to be remembered as the most beautiful celebration the town of Nurabad had ever seen. The white silk canopy shimmered beneath golden chandeliers, crystal glasses sparkled under soft lights, and the scent of fresh jasmine filled the evening air. Guests whispered about how perfect she looked. Her dress, embroidered with silver thread, clung to her frame like it had been stitched by angels. Her smile was calm, graceful, almost royal. No one suspected that beneath the makeup, beneath the diamonds resting on her collarbone, beneath the gentle tilt of her head, a secret older than her engagement was waiting to erupt. Aliyah had grown up in a house where silence was heavier than words. Her father, Karim Rahman, was a respected businessman, a man whose voice alone could silence an entire room. He believed in appearances above everything else. Reputation, he used to say, is more valuable than blood. From childhood, Aliyah learned that emotions were weaknesses, mistakes were unforgivable, and truth was negotiable if it threatened family honor. She was taught to smile even when her world felt like it was cracking, especially then. At 16, she had already mastered the art of pretending. There had been rumors years ago, whispers about her mother's sudden disappearance. Officially, her mother died of illness, but there had been no hospital records shown, no grave visitors, no mourning period that felt real. Just a quiet replacement of her mother's photographs and a stern warning never to ask questions again. Aliyah obeyed. She always obeyed. Yet at night, she would stare at the ceiling and remember her mother's trembling hands the day before she vanished. She remembered the argument behind closed doors. She remembered a crash. And she remembered silence afterward. Now, at 24, she stood beside a man she barely knew. Zaid Mirza was everything her father approved of: wealthy, ambitious, and politically connected. His family owned half the real estate across the province. He had a controlled smile and eyes that calculated more than they revealed. Their engagement had been announced only 3 months after their first formal meeting. Aliyah had not objected. Obedience had long ago replaced desire in her vocabulary. But secrets do not disappear simply because they are ignored. 2 weeks before the wedding, an envelope arrived at her private apartment. It had no return address. Inside was a single photograph. The image was grainy but unmistakable. It showed her mother standing outside an old warehouse near the river docks. The date stamped on the corner was from just 6 months ago. 6 months. Her mother was supposed to have died 8 years earlier. The blood drained from Aliyah's face as she stared at the proof that her childhood grief had been built on a lie. On the back of the photograph, a message was written in sharp black ink. "Ask your father what really happened, or your wedding will answer for you." She burned the envelope that night, but she did not burn the fear. She tried confronting her father carefully, choosing words that would not ignite his temper. She mentioned a dream about her mother. She asked about the hospital. Karim's face hardened instantly. He warned her that imagination was dangerous. He reminded her that stress before marriage was common. He ordered her to focus on the future. That was the moment she knew the threat was real. On the morning of her wedding, as makeup artists circled her like silent artists preparing a masterpiece, Aliyah felt the weight of something inevitable pressing against her ribs. Every laugh from downstairs echoed too loudly. Every compliment felt rehearsed. The photograph replayed in her mind like a curse. What if her mother was alive? And if she was, why had she disappeared? The ceremony began at sunset. Music flowed gently across the hall as guests took their seats. Zaid stood at the altar, confident, immaculate. His expression did not waver when Aliyah entered. Cameras flashed. Applause filled the room. Her father walked beside her, his hand firm on her arm, almost possessive. As they approached the stage, Aaliyah noticed something strange. A woman sat near the back of the hall, dressed in plain gray, her head covered modestly. She did not clap. She did not smile. She simply watched, and her eyes were familiar. Aaliyah's steps faltered for half a second. Her father's grip tightened painfully, warning her not to create a scene. The woman's gaze did not break. It was filled with something deeper than anger. It was sorrow. The vows began. The officiant spoke about unity, trust, loyalty, and truth. Each word felt like mockery. Aaliyah's pulse thundered in her ears. She could barely hear Zaid's voice as he repeated his promises. When it was her turn, she opened her mouth to speak, but her eyes drifted again to the back of the hall. The woman was gone. Instead, a large screen behind the stage flickered. At first, everyone assumed it was part of the wedding montage, a surprise slideshow prepared by friends. Soft music started playing, and childhood photos of Aaliyah appeared. Guests smiled, touched by nostalgia. But then the images shifted. The screen showed security footage. A warehouse by the river docks. A woman stepping out of a car. Her mother. Gasps rippled across the hall. The footage zoomed in. The timestamp was clear, 3 weeks earlier. The next clip showed Kareem Rahman arriving at the same location, speaking harshly to the woman. Though there was no audio, his anger was visible in every sharp gesture. Then came the final clip. 2 men dragging the woman back into the warehouse as she struggled. The screen went black. Silence swallowed the hall. Aaliyah's bouquet slipped from her hands. Her father's face had drained of all color. Zaid stepped back slowly, as if instinctively distancing himself from the storm. Guests began murmuring, some standing, others recording on their phones. The illusion of perfection shattered within seconds. The officiant tried to calm the crowd, but panic had already begun spreading like wildfire. Aaliyah turned toward her father, her voice trembling but loud enough to cut through the chaos. "Is she alive?" Kareem did not answer. For the first time in her life, she saw fear in his eyes. Security rushed to disconnect the screen, but the damage was done. The secret that had been buried for years had risen in front of hundreds of witnesses. Reputation, the one thing her father worshipped, was collapsing in real time. Zaid's parents whispered urgently among themselves. Some guests began leaving. Others demanded explanations. The wedding that was meant to seal alliances had turned into a public accusation. Aaliyah felt something inside her shift. For years, she had obeyed to survive. But in that moment, survival meant something different. It meant truth. It meant answers. It meant breaking the silence that had imprisoned her since childhood. She removed her veil slowly and let it fall to the ground. "I want the police called," she said, her voice steady now. The words echoed like thunder. Her father reached for her arm again, but she stepped away. Cameras captured everything. The disgraced businessman, the shattered bride, the crumbling alliance between 2 powerful families. Somewhere in the distance, sirens began to wail. And in the middle of the ruined wedding hall, Aaliyah Rahman realized that her marriage had never been the real event of the evening. It had simply been the stage chosen for exposure. The darker history of her family was no longer hidden. It had just begun. The sirens did not stop echoing in Aaliyah's mind long after the police cars surrounded the wedding hall. Even when officers escorted her father outside, even when guests whispered and scattered like frightened birds, even when reporters began shouting questions beyond the gates, the sound of that wail stayed lodged inside her chest like something permanent. Her wedding dress, once a symbol of union, now felt like evidence. Heavy, restricting, stained by humiliation and truth. She did not cry. That surprised everyone. Her father, Kareem Rahman, was placed in the back of a police vehicle. Not arrested yet, but detained for questioning. His lawyers had already been called. His influence still carried weight. Powerful men do not fall easily. They bend systems. They delay consequences. They rewrite narratives. Aaliyah knew this better than anyone. But the footage had been seen by too many people. Inside the now chaotic hall, Zaid Mirza stood in a corner, his face unreadable. His family had already left through a private exit, shielding themselves from reporters. The alliance that had been carefully negotiated between two wealthy dynasties was cracking in real time. And yet, Zayd did not approach Aliyah immediately. He watched her from a distance, calculating. That was when she noticed something that unsettled her more than the video itself. He did not look shocked. He looked prepared. Hours later, after statements were taken and guests were dismissed, Aliyah returned to the Rahman estate alone. The house felt larger than usual, its marble floors cold beneath her bare feet. Servants avoided her eyes. Some of them had worked in that house since before her mother vanished. How many of them knew? How many had been silent? Her bedroom still smelled of perfume and celebration. Gifts were stacked against the walls, unopened, meaningless. She locked the door behind her and finally allowed her mask to slip. Not tears, not hysteria, just a long, trembling breath. The photograph had been a warning. The footage had been a threat fulfilled. But who had sent it? She replayed every interaction from the past 2 weeks. There had been strange calls that disconnected when she answered. A car that seemed to follow her once near the shopping district. A florist who insisted on delivering white lilies personally, though no one had ordered them. She had dismissed these as stress-induced paranoia. Now she understood that someone had orchestrated this carefully. Her phone vibrated on the bedside table. Unknown number. She hesitated only a second before answering. "You finally saw the truth," a distorted voice said. Calm, controlled. "Who are you?" she demanded. "Someone your father thought he buried." The line went silent. Aliyah's pulse hammered violently. The phrase echoed inside her skull. Thought he buried. Not metaphorically, literally. Her mind returned to the warehouse footage. The final clip had cut abruptly. There was no proof of death. Only violence implied. Could her mother still be alive somewhere? Hidden? Imprisoned? Or worse, had the video been recorded before something final happened? Sleep did not come that night. By morning, media channels were exploding with speculation. Headlines called it the wedding scandal of the year. Analysts debated Karim Rahman's business dealings. Old rivals resurfaced with accusations. Investors began withdrawing shares from his companies. The empire he built through intimidation and control was trembling. But Aliyah's focus was not on public disgrace. It was on the warehouse. She left the estate before sunrise, still wearing yesterday's dress beneath a black coat. No driver. No security. She took her own car and drove toward the river docks. The sky hung gray and heavy, matching the weight in her chest. The warehouse stood exactly as in the footage, abandoned from the outside, rust creeping along its metal doors. The area smelled of salt water and decay. For years she had passed this district without curiosity. Now every shadow felt alive. The side entrance was unlocked. Inside, dust coated everything. Broken crates lay scattered across the concrete floor. But something was wrong. This place was not fully abandoned. There were fresh footprints near the back wall. Cigarette ashes still warm. She moved carefully, her heartbeat loud in the emptiness. Then she saw it. A chair, metal, bolted to the ground. And beside it, a thin gold bracelet she recognized instantly. It had belonged to her mother. Her knees nearly gave out. She picked it up with shaking hands. The clasp was broken, as if torn during a struggle. Anger rose through her veins, replacing fear. This was no longer a mystery. This was proof. A noise echoed from the far corner. She turned sharply. A man stepped out from the shadows. Tall, unshaven, eyes tired but alert. He raised his hands slowly to show he meant no immediate harm. "I was wondering when you'd come," he said quietly. "Who are you?" she asked, gripping the bracelet tightly. "My name doesn't matter. What matters is that your father has been keeping someone alive who should have been free years ago." Her breath caught. "My mother." The man nodded once. "Where is she?" He studied her carefully, as if measuring whether she was strong enough to handle the truth. Hidden, controlled, because she knew something that could destroy him. Aliyah's mind raced. Destroy him how? Your father's fortune isn't as clean as it looks. Human trafficking routes disguised as shipping businesses. Political bribes. Disappearances. Your mother found documents. She threatened to expose him. The words felt like knives slicing through the version of her father she had clung to, even after the wedding humiliation. She had known he was ruthless in business. She had not known he was monstrous. He locked her away instead. The man continued. Made the world believe she was dead. Why tell me now? She demanded. Because he's planning to move her. After last night's exposure, he knows the walls are closing in. If she disappears again, this time it won't be temporary. Aaliyah felt the floor shift beneath her. Time was running out. Take me to her, she said. The man hesitated. If you do this, there's no going back. He won't see you as a daughter anymore. You'll be an enemy. She thought of the years of silence. The lies. The forced marriage. The humiliation. The buried truth. I stopped being his daughter the day he erased my mother, she replied. Before the man could answer, footsteps echoed outside the warehouse. Multiple footsteps. Heavy. The stranger's expression hardened. He's faster than I expected. The main doors burst open. Several men entered, armed, dressed in black. Not police, private security. And behind them, Zaid Mirza. He walked in calmly, hands in his coat pockets, as if inspecting property he owned. Aaliyah stared at him in disbelief. You knew. Zaid's gaze softened slightly, but not with guilt. I suspected. Your father and mine have been partners longer than you realize. The words hit harder than any physical blow. This marriage, he continued evenly, was meant to secure loyalty, to keep you quiet, to ensure you never went looking. Her stomach twisted violently. The wedding had not just been a social alliance. It had been containment. You helped him, she whispered. Zaid did not deny it. Business requires difficult decisions. The stranger beside her shifted, ready to run. But armed men blocked every exit. You should have stayed silent, Zaid said, his voice almost regretful. Last night complicated things. Aaliyah felt something snap inside her. Fear dissolved. In its place came fury sharp enough to cut steel. My mother is not a business inconvenience, she said. Zaid signaled to his men. They advanced. But in that moment, distant sirens echoed again, closer this time. Police. The stranger smirked faintly. You're not the only one who planned ahead. Zaid's calm expression cracked for the first time. The armed men hesitated. Escape calculations flickered across their faces. Within seconds, the warehouse filled with shouting commands as officers stormed inside. Weapons dropped. Hands raised. Chaos swallowed the building. Zaid stepped back slowly, his eyes never leaving Aaliyah's. For the first time, she saw not calculation but anger. This isn't over, he said quietly as officers cuffed him. She believed him. As the police secured the scene, Aaliyah stood alone in the center of the warehouse, clutching her mother's bracelet. Her wedding dress brushed against the dirty concrete floor, its purity ruined beyond repair. But she no longer cared about purity. She cared about truth. An officer approached her gently. Miss Rahman, we found records in the back office. Locations. Safe houses. We think one of them might hold your mother. Her heart stopped. Alive? She asked. We don't know yet. The uncertainty was both hope and terror combined. As she stepped out of the warehouse into the pale morning light, reporters were already gathering beyond police tape. Cameras flashed again, but this time she did not feel exposed. She felt awake. The darker history of her family was unraveling thread by thread. And at the center of it stood not a helpless bride, but a woman who had finally chosen to break the silence. Somewhere in the city, hidden behind locked doors and guarded secrets, her mother might still be breathing. And if she was, Aaliyah would find her, no matter how much blood stained the path ahead. By the time the sun fully rose over Nurabad, Aaliyah Rahman was no longer the bride whose wedding had collapsed under scandal. She had become something far more dangerous, a witness to truth. The police convoy moved quietly through the industrial outskirts of the city, following coordinates recovered from the warehouse office. The location pointed toward an old farmhouse registered under a shell corporation linked to one of Karim Rahman's subsidiaries. It was the kind of property meant to disappear into paperwork, forgotten by public records but never truly abandoned. Aliyah sat in the back of the police vehicle, still wearing the same wedding dress beneath her coat. The white fabric felt symbolic now, not of innocence, but of deception. She wondered how many lies had been wrapped around her life like lace, stitched carefully, beautifully, and suffocatingly. She held her mother's broken bracelet tightly in her palm, the metal pressing into her skin as if grounding her in reality. The farmhouse came into view slowly, surrounded by dry land and leafless trees. It looked quiet, almost peaceful, the kind of place where no one would think to search for something terrible. That was the genius of her father. He never hid darkness in darkness. He buried it in calm. Officers approached cautiously. There were no visible guards outside. No cars in the driveway. Just silence thick enough to feel deliberate. The front door was locked but not reinforced. It took less than a minute to breach. The air inside smelled stale, like a house that had been closed for too long. Dust floated through thin beams of sunlight. At first glance, it appeared abandoned. But as officers moved deeper inside, subtle signs of occupation emerged. Fresh water bottles in a kitchen bin, recently used plates in the sink, footprints on the wooden floor. Then they heard it, a faint sound from below. Aliyah's breath caught as officers located a concealed door behind a bookshelf in the living room. It led to a staircase descending into darkness, the kind of darkness that swallowed hope. Flashlights flickered on. Weapons were drawn. Each step down felt heavier than the last. At the bottom was a reinforced metal door, locked from the outside. One officer forced it open. The beam of light fell across a small concrete room. There was a bed against the wall, a thin blanket, plastic chair, and sitting on the edge of that bed, her wrists thin and trembling, was a woman whose face Aliyah knew more intimately than her own reflection. Her mother, older, frilier, hair streaked with gray, but alive. The world tilted. For a moment, Aliyah could not move. 8 years of grief, confusion, anger, and unanswered questions collided in a single heartbeat. Her mother lifted her head slowly, blinking against the harsh light. When their eyes met, recognition flickered through the exhaustion. "Aliyah," her mother whispered. The sound of her name in that voice shattered something inside her. She ran forward without thinking, dropping to her knees, wrapping her arms around the fragile body that had once held her through childhood nightmares. Her mother's bones felt too sharp beneath her skin, too light, as if time had starved her. "I thought you were dead," Aliyah choked. "They wanted you to believe that," her mother replied weakly. Officers stepped back respectfully, allowing the reunion to unfold in raw silence. A medic was called immediately. Her mother, Samina Rahman, had been kept alive, but barely. Malnourished, isolated, controlled. The basement room had no windows, no clock, no connection to the outside world. Time had been stolen from her. As medics assessed her condition, Samina's trembling hand found Aliyah's face. "You shouldn't have come," she murmured. "I was never going to stop looking," Aliyah replied, though part of her knew that wasn't entirely true. Until the photograph arrived, she had accepted the lie. They escorted Samina upstairs carefully. As fresh air touched her face, she closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, like someone resurfacing after drowning for years. The sunlight seemed almost painful against her pale skin. Back in the police vehicle, wrapped in a blanket, Samina began speaking in fragmented sentences. Her voice was fragile, but her mind was clear. "Your father, he changed years ago," she said quietly. "The business was never just shipping. I found documents, names, routes, girls disappearing from small villages, money moving through charities." Aliyah listened, her stomach tightening. "I confronted him," Samina continued. "I told him I would go to the authorities, that I would expose everything." "And he locked you away," Aliyah said. Samina nodded faintly. He said family reputation mattered more than morality. He said no one would believe me, and he was right. He controlled too many people. Alia's thoughts turned to Zaid Mirza, his calm presence in the warehouse, his family's partnership with her father. The marriage had not just been strategic, it had been protection for both empires. If she had married Zaid, her loyalty would have been absorbed into silence. Zaid knew, she said quietly. Samina's expression darkened. The Mirza family profits from the same network. The truth felt heavier with each revelation. This was no isolated cruelty. It was a system, a machine fueled by influence and fear. By afternoon, news of Samina Rahman's survival broke across media channels. The scandal transformed from wedding humiliation into a criminal investigation of national scale. Protesters gathered outside corporate offices. Political figures distanced themselves. Allies became silent. Karim Rahman was officially arrested. But Alia knew arrests did not equal justice. Back at the hospital, as doctors worked to stabilize her mother, Alia sat alone in the waiting area. She finally changed out of her wedding dress, folding it neatly into a plastic evidence bag provided by investigators. The white fabric now represented something darker, a reminder of how close she had come to becoming part of the lie permanently. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. She answered cautiously. "You think you've won?" the distorted voice asked. Her spine stiffened. "Who is this?" "You exposed one branch of a tree whose roots run far deeper." Her breath slowed. "If you're threatening me, save it. I'm warning you. Your father was not the architect. He was a manager." The line went dead. The words lingered. Not the architect. Alia's mind raced. If Karim and the Mirzas were partners, who stood above them? Who had the power to coordinate trafficking routes, bribe officials, and silence witnesses across provinces? The scale was larger than she imagined. That evening, an investigator named Inspector Farouk requested a private conversation. He was calm, experienced, careful with his words. "We recovered encrypted files from your father's office," he explained. "Some of them reference a code name, the patron, large transfers, international contacts." Alia felt cold. "Do you know who that is?" "We suspect someone with political immunity." The implications were chilling. This was not just a family crime. It was institutional rot. As night settled, Alia visited her mother's hospital room. Samina was resting, and 4 in her arm, her breathing steadier. The room was quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors. Alia sat beside her and gently brushed hair away from her forehead. "You survived," Alia whispered. Samina's eyes opened slowly. "I refused to die," she replied faintly. "I stayed alive for you." The words filled Alia with both gratitude and fury. 8 years stolen. 8 years of isolation endured for the hope of reunion. "I'm going to finish this," Alia said softly. "All of it." Samina studied her daughter carefully. "It will cost you. It already has." Outside the hospital, cameras still waited. Reporters shouted updates. Analysts debated corruption networks. Social media turned Alia into a symbol overnight. Some called her brave, others called her reckless. But she did not care about perception anymore. For the first time in her life, she was not living under her father's shadow. Yet she understood something deeply unsettling. The exposure at her wedding had not been random. Someone had timed it perfectly. Someone who wanted maximum humiliation, maximum damage. Someone who hated Karim Rahman enough to orchestrate public destruction. And that person was still hidden. As she stood by the hospital window looking out at the city lights, Alia realized that saving her mother was only the beginning. The darker history of her family was entangled with men far more powerful than her father. If the patron felt threatened, retaliation would come. Power does not collapse quietly. It strikes back. And somewhere beyond the headlines and arrests, beyond the hospital walls and police files, someone was watching her next move carefully. The bride who had been meant to secure silence had instead ignited exposure. But exposure is dangerous, because once truth surfaces, Those who built their empires on lies will do anything to bury it again. Aaliyah placed her mother's bracelet on the bedside table and made a silent vow. This time, no one would disappear. Not her mother. Not the girls her father's network had stolen. Not the truth. Even if it meant becoming something far darker than the obedient daughter she once was. The city did not sleep anymore. Nurabad pulsed with tension, its skyline glowing beneath restless headlines and political whispers. What had begun as a ruined wedding had evolved into a national scandal that clawed at the foundations of power. Karim Rahman's arrest was no longer the climax of the story. It was the crack in a much larger structure. And at the center of that widening fracture stood a name spoken only in encrypted files and cautious meetings. The patron. Aaliyah Rahman had never imagined that her search for her mother would place her on a path that cut through corridors of influence and fear. The hospital room where Samina recovered had become both sanctuary and strategy room. Investigators came and went with documents, photos, and hushed updates. Yet even surrounded by officers, Aaliyah sensed an invisible resistance. There were delays in warrants, files requested but not delivered, officials who suddenly stopped returning calls. It felt as if unseen hands were tightening around the investigation, slowing it without stopping it outright. Inspector Farouk visited late one evening, his usually composed expression strained. He placed a thin folder on the table beside Aaliyah. "We traced the code name," he said quietly. "The financial routes extend beyond national borders. Offshore accounts, political foundations, shell charities. The patron is not just a financier. He coordinates protection." Aaliyah's jaw tightened. Protection from whom? From exposure. From prosecution. From consequences. She understood immediately. This was not simply a criminal network, it was an ecosystem. Police officers bribed. Journalists intimidated. Judges persuaded. Disappearances rewritten as accidents. Karim Rahman had been a node in a web woven by someone far more insulated. "Do you know his real name?" she asked. Farouk hesitated, then nodded once. "We have strong evidence pointing toward Minister Rafiq Ansari." The name landed heavily. Rafiq Ansari was a senior cabinet minister, publicly celebrated for philanthropic campaigns and social development initiatives. He appeared regularly on television advocating for women's education and economic reform. His speeches were polished, his image carefully curated. The idea that he could be orchestrating trafficking routes behind closed doors was almost too calculated to comprehend. Aaliyah felt a cold clarity settle over her. "If he has immunity, how do you touch him?" Farouk exhaled slowly. "You don't. Not directly. You build a case so airtight that even immunity becomes fragile." The challenge was monumental. Ansari's influence stretched across agencies. Witnesses would be intimidated. Evidence could vanish. The moment he sensed real danger, he would strike first. That realization became painfully clear 2 days later. Samina Rahman had been scheduled to give a formal recorded statement detailing the documents she discovered years ago. It was meant to strengthen the prosecution against Karim and establish motive. But that morning, before the recording could take place, the hospital experienced a power outage. Backup generators activated, but in the brief darkness, someone attempted to access Samina's room. A nurse reported seeing a man in a medical coat who disappeared before identification. Security footage from that corridor was conveniently corrupted. The message was unmistakable. Someone was watching. Aaliyah's anger no longer felt sharp and explosive. It had evolved into something colder and more strategic. She understood now that emotional reactions would only make her vulnerable. The patron operated through calculation. To defeat him, she would have to think the same way. That night, she requested a private meeting with Inspector Farouk away from official offices. They met in an unmarked building used for confidential operations. Files were spread across a wooden table under dim lighting. Photographs of warehouses, bank transfers, political fundraisers, and missing persons reports formed a mosaic of corruption. "There's something you're not considering," Aaliyah said quietly. Farouk looked up. "What is that?" The wedding exposure wasn't random. Someone leaked the footage intentionally to destabilize my father before his arrest. It humiliated him publicly. That kind of move isn't from a loyal insider. It's from someone seeking leverage. Farouk considered this. You think the patron orchestrated it? No. If Ansari wanted to protect himself, he would have silenced my father quietly. The public spectacle suggests internal conflict. The idea shifted the investigation's direction. If there was fracture within the network, it meant vulnerability. Power structures often collapse from internal betrayal rather than external attack. Farouk nodded slowly. A rival, or a subordinate tired of being disposable, Aliyah replied. Over the following days, they examined financial transfers more closely. Patterns emerged. Funds rerouted shortly before the wedding. Accounts drained from certain intermediaries. Someone had anticipated exposure and repositioned assets. Meanwhile, media attention intensified. Protesters gathered outside the ministry building demanding transparency. Opposition parties seized the opportunity to question Ansari's integrity. Though he denied all allegations publicly, his carefully measured statements lacked the confidence of his usual speeches. Behind closed doors, pressure mounted. Aliyah visited her father in detention for the first time since his arrest. The room was sterile, divided by glass. Karim Rahman appeared older within days. His once commanding posture diminished but not broken. His eyes held resentment more than regret. You should have stayed loyal, he said without greeting. Loyal to what? She asked calmly. To a lie. His jaw tightened. You don't understand the scale of what you've interfered with. Then explain it. He leaned closer to the glass. Ansari is not the top. He answers to international investors who treat countries like assets. Trafficking routes are just one revenue stream. If you think exposing me makes you safe, you're naive. The words chilled her. Who are they? She demanded. Karim's gaze flickered with something that might have been fear. People you will never reach. For the first time, she sensed that even her father had operated under pressure. That did not absolve him, but it revealed the depth of the system. As she left the detention center, a black vehicle idled across the street. Its windows were tinted, engine running. She felt eyes on her. The car drove away slowly once she noticed. Surveillance had begun. Days later, Inspector Farouk received a confidential tip from an anonymous source willing to testify, under conditions of extreme protection. The source claimed to be a financial coordinator within Ansari's inner circle. He provided encrypted files that linked ministerial accounts directly to shell corporations funding the trafficking routes. The risk of trusting him was immense, but the opportunity was greater. Arrangements were made for a discreet meeting. Aliyah insisted on attending, despite warnings. She understood the narrative power of her presence. The bride whose wedding exposed corruption was now confronting the machinery itself. The meeting took place in a remote guest house under heavy security. The anonymous source arrived masked, voice trembling beneath controlled composure. He explained how Ansari leveraged charity organizations to move funds internationally. He described meetings where politicians negotiated silence in exchange for investments. He sees himself as untouchable, the source said. He believes fear is permanent. Aliyah listened carefully. Why betray him now? The man hesitated. Because once he suspects weakness, he eliminates liabilities. I am next. Fear had cracked loyalty. With the new evidence, prosecutors prepared a strategy to request parliamentary suspension of Ansari's immunity. It would ignite political warfare. It would expose alliances. It would force public votes. The night before the motion was filed, an explosion shattered the calm outside Samina's hospital. A car parked near the entrance detonated, damaging windows and injuring several bystanders. The blast was not large enough to destroy the building, but it was loud enough to terrify. A warning. Aliyah stood outside amid smoke and flashing emergency lights, her heart pounding but her expression steady. She understood the psychology. Intimidate the witness. Destabilize the narrative. Shift public sympathy through chaos. But instead of retreating, she stepped in front of the cameras gathered beyond police tape. They want fear, she said into the microphones, her voice unwavering. They want silence. I will give them neither. The statement spread across networks within hours. Public opinion hardened. What had once been scandal transformed into outrage. Inside the ministry, pressure mounted against Ansari. Allies distanced themselves subtly. Some began leaking minor documents to appear cooperative. The ecosystem of corruption began fracturing visibly. Yet Aliyah knew something deeper remained unresolved. Her father had hinted at international backers. Investors who treated entire populations as assets. If Ansari fell, those forces would simply reposition unless exposed. Late that night, she received another call from the distorted voice that had first warned her. You're moving too fast, it said. Who are you? She demanded again. A survivor, the voice replied. Like your mother. I lost my sister to their network. Silence stretched. You leaked the wedding footage, Aliyah said slowly. Yes. Why? Because your father was becoming reckless. And because you were the only variable he underestimated. The revelation stunned her. She had not been targeted as collateral. She had been chosen as a catalyst. You used me, she said quietly. I gave you the truth. What you do with it is your choice. The line disconnected once more. Aliyah stared at her phone, understanding that the battle was no longer personal vengeance. It had evolved into systemic confrontation. She had been positioned at the intersection of exposure and reform. But exposure invites retaliation. As dawn approached, intelligence reports indicated that Ansari was preparing to leave the country under the pretext of an international conference. Diplomatic immunity would shield him abroad. If he left, accountability might evaporate. Inspector Farouk called urgently. We need to move now. Aliyah felt the weight of inevitability settle over her. The darker history of her family had expanded beyond blood and betrayal. It had become a fight against power insulated by prestige. She looked at her reflection in the hospital window. No veil, no wedding dress, no obedient daughter staring back. Instead, she saw someone shaped by revelation, sharpened by loss. Power believed it could bury truth indefinitely. But truth had already surfaced. And once unearthed, it does not return quietly to the ground. The mourning minister Rafiq Ansari attempted to leave Nurabad under diplomatic pretext. The city felt suspended between exposure and escape. News channels reported his scheduled departure as routine international diplomacy. But behind the official narrative, a different reality unfolded. Arrest warrants were being drafted. Parliamentary debates had turned volatile. Allies who once defended him were calculating survival. And at the center of the accelerating storm stood Aliyah Rahman, no longer a scandalized bride, but the face of a reckoning that had grown larger than her family. Inspector Farouk had confirmed what intelligence units feared. Ansari planned to board a private chartered flight before formal suspension of his immunity could be processed. Once abroad, extradition would become a diplomatic labyrinth. The window to act was narrowing rapidly. Legal teams scrambled through technicalities, racing against influence that could still manipulate outcomes behind closed doors. Every minute mattered. Aliyah watched events unfold from the hospital corridor where her mother continued recovering. Samina Rahman had regained strength slowly, but the psychological weight of 8 stolen years lingered in her eyes. She understood the urgency without needing full briefings. The system that had imprisoned her would not surrender quietly. They will try to flee before they fall, Samina said softly. They already are, Aliyah replied. But the decision facing her was more personal than political. Investigators had requested her formal testimony linking Karim Rahman's confession to Ansari's financial network. Her words would become part of the parliamentary motion seeking emergency suspension of immunity. Speaking publicly meant eliminating any chance of retreat. It meant placing herself permanently in opposition to powerful forces that operated beyond national borders. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a different life, a quiet one, a life where her wedding had proceeded normally, where obedience preserved comfort. That life would have required silence. It would have required abandoning the women whose names were buried in financial spreadsheets. It would have required forgiving the imprisonment of her mother. Silence was no longer possible. By midday, legal pressure mounted visibly. Opposition members demanded emergency hearings. Civil groups flooded the streets. International media began covering the scandal as an emblem of systemic corruption. Ansari's office released statements calling the allegations politically motivated, yet the cracks in his confidence showed. His public appearances grew shorter, his language defensive rather than assured. Behind those statements, he prepared to leave. Authorities received confirmation that his convoy had departed the ministry en route to the private airstrip outside the city. Inspector Farouk mobilized units with a temporary judicial order restricting travel pending review. It was fragile, dependent on swift execution before counterorders could emerge. Aliyah insisted on accompanying Farouk to the parliamentary complex where the emergency session was unfolding. Her presence was strategic. Public narrative mattered as much as legal maneuvering. If Ansari boarded that flight quietly, public faith in justice would fracture beyond repair. Inside the complex, debates were heated. Lawmakers shouted across aisles. Allegations of conspiracy and retaliation filled the chamber. The motion to suspend immunity required majority support. Every vote was being negotiated in real time. Meanwhile, at the airstrip, Ansari's convoy approached the terminal reserved for diplomatic travel. His security detail remained loyal, though unease lingered beneath their discipline. He believed his position insulated him. For years it had. But insulation weakens when exposed to light. Back in the chamber, the vote commenced. Screens displayed tallies incrementally. Aliyah stood in the gallery, hands steady despite the tremor in her pulse. Each vote felt like a heartbeat. Some lawmakers abstained, unwilling to risk alignment. Others, sensing public outrage, voted in favor. The final count surpassed the threshold by a narrow margin. Immunity suspended. The decision triggered immediate authorization to detain Ansari pending investigation. At the airstrip, officers intercepted the convoy moments before boarding clearance. Legal documents were presented. Ansari's composure fractured for the first time as he realized departure was no longer guaranteed. His protests referenced procedure, international protocol, political vendetta. But the order was legitimate. He was escorted away from the aircraft under formal arrest. News spread across Nurabad within minutes. Crowds gathered outside the ministry, chanting not in celebration, but in release. For years, fear had dictated silence. That silence was breaking. Yet victory felt incomplete to Aliyah, because Ansari was not the root. In detention, he remained defiant. Through counsel, he denied leadership of any network, framing himself as a victim of political sabotage. However, encrypted files recovered from his private servers painted a different narrative. Communications revealed coordination with offshore investors, references to asset transfers, contingency plans for liability containment. The phrase chilled investigators. Liability containment. It implied elimination. Further analysis uncovered evidence of international financial institutions facilitating money movement under philanthropic cover. Foundations registered in multiple countries funneled funds through legal loopholes. The network extended far beyond Nurabad. Karim Rahman, confronted with the scale of Ansari's exposure, began cooperating in exchange for potential sentence reduction. Pride had kept him silent initially. Survival changed his posture. He confirmed that Ansari answered to foreign investors who treated trafficking routes as revenue streams within diversified portfolios. Names were coded, but patterns were consistent. Aliyah visited her father again, not for reconciliation, but for clarity. Behind reinforced glass, he looked diminished yet calculating. "You see now," he said quietly. "Removing one man doesn't dismantle the structure." "No," she replied calmly, "but it destabilizes it." He studied her with unfamiliar recognition. "You were never meant to fight this." "I was never meant to know," she corrected. For the first time, he lowered his gaze. Trials began weeks later. Testimonies from survivors emerged. Financial analysts decoded transactions linking corporations to missing persons reports. International watchdog organizations launched parallel investigations. Governments abroad faced pressure to audit affiliated foundations. The exposure triggered a chain reaction. Investors withdrew quietly from questionable ventures. Political allies rebranded themselves as reformists. Some mid-level coordinators attempted to flee. Arrests multiplied. But retaliation did not disappear. Aaliyah received credible threats requiring constant protection. Anonymous messages warned of consequences. Surveillance persisted. The network, though fractured, was not entirely dismantled. Those who profited from silence resented the disruption. Samina Rahman, now stronger, urged caution but never retreat. They relied on invisibility, she said. You stripped that away. Public perception of Aaliyah evolved beyond scandal. She became a reluctant symbol of defiance. Universities invited her to speak about accountability. Advocacy groups sought collaboration. Yet she resisted hero narratives. She understood how close she had come to remaining silent. The wedding dress remained sealed in evidence storage. It represented the turning point, a stage meant to secure obedience that instead ignited exposure. She chose not to retrieve it. Some symbols are better left archived. Months passed. Court proceedings progressed slowly but steadily. Ansari's influence eroded as international partners distanced themselves. His arrest emboldened journalists to investigate adjacent industries. What had once seemed untouchable became scrutinized. The anonymous whistleblower who had first leaked the footage contacted Aaliyah one final time, revealing his identity under protected status. He had been a mid-level financial analyst within Ansari's organization. His sister had disappeared years earlier along a trafficking route masked as employment relocation. He had accessed security archives and orchestrated the wedding exposure, knowing maximum public visibility would prevent quiet suppression. You were the one variable they misjudged, he told her during a secure meeting. They believed loyalty was inherited. It isn't, she replied. International tribunals began reviewing cross-border elements of the network. Though complex and slow, the process signaled that impunity was no longer absolute. The system would not collapse overnight, but it was no longer invisible. One evening, standing on the balcony of her family estate, now stripped of its former opulence due to asset freezes, Aaliyah watched the city lights flicker beneath the horizon. Nurabad felt different, not healed, but aware. Her life had transformed irreversibly. She was no longer sheltered by privilege nor defined by it. She had chosen confrontation over comfort, truth over tradition. The cost was immense. Security escorts, legal battles, permanent caution, but silence would have cost more. Her mother joined her on the balcony, strength returning slowly with each passing week. They stood side by side without speaking for a long moment. You ended what he began, Samina said quietly. No, Aaliyah corrected. I exposed it. Ending it will take longer. Power structures rarely disappear. Entirely. They adapt, rebrand, resurface in new forms. But exposure reshapes their terrain. It introduces risk where once there was certainty. In detention, Ansari awaited trial under diminished influence. Karim Rahman prepared for sentencing, cooperation noted but not absolving. The international investors remained under investigation, some facing sanctions abroad. And Aaliyah Rahman, once a bride walking toward a carefully arranged alliance, had become the disruption no one predicted. Her wedding day had not been the beginning of a marriage. It had been the beginning of collapse. The darker history of her family was no longer buried beneath polished reputations and curated speeches. It was documented, televised, archived in court transcripts. It existed in public memory, and that memory would not be easily erased. As night deepened over Nurabad, Aaliyah understood something profound. Fear thrives in secrecy. Once illuminated, it weakens. Not instantly, not completely, but inevitably. She had been raised to protect reputation above truth. Instead, she chose truth above power. And in doing so, She transformed from a symbol of obedience into a catalyst of reckoning. The bride who stood beneath chandeliers on her wedding night had smiled to preserve illusion. The woman standing now beneath the open sky carried no veil at all, and there would never again be one placed over her eyes.